Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hope for Animals Summit. Thanks for tuning in to this webinar series, and it's presented by In Defense of Animals and animal communicator Joan Ranquet. We're delighted to introduce you to speakers who provide you with rays of hope for the animals during this time of political unrest. Each speaker has advocacy kits that are available at idausa.org/hope Summit. That's where you'll also find more details about the speakers and their presentations. So I'm your host, Lisa Levinson, Director of IDA's Sustainable Activism Campaign, providing emotional resources for animal activists. Please turn your microphones and webcams off for the duration of the webinar. We will have a Q&A session after the speaker presentation, and you can ask the speaker questions via the chat box which will be monitored by Sally Jenkins. Here's my co-host, Joan Ranquet, who will introduce you to our featured speaker today.
Thank you, Lisa. And we are very excited to have Jonathan Balcombe, PhD, and he is a biologist, author, and a lifelong animal advocate. His 2006 book, Pleasurable Kingdom, is the first in-depth examination of animals' capacity to enjoy life. His subsequent books, Second Nature and The Exultant Ark, also present animals in a new light and presage a revolution in the human-animal relationship. His new book, the New York Times bestseller What a Fish Knows, explores the private lives of the planet's most misunderstood and maligned vertebrates. Balcombe is Director for Animal Sentience with the Humane Society Institute for Science and Policy and Associate Editor for Animal Sentience, the first scholarly journal of animal feeling. He recently moved to Florida, where in his spare time he enjoys swimming, snorkeling, biking, baking, birding, Bach, and trying to understand the lizards on his patio. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thanks, Joan. Should I click share screen at this stage, or can people see me?
Yes, people can see you. And you're welcome to take it away. We're so grateful that you're here today, John.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to launch right in because time is limited. Thanks for the introductions, Joan and Lisa, and thanks for the people who are here joining me today. I can't see you. That's a bit weird, but it's nice to know you're there. I want to start with a personal story from my childhood. But I'm not able to make the slide go forward, and I thought I'd have control over that. Is that something I can control?
Yes, you'll need to push the share screen button. Did you push that?
Okay, no, I didn't. I was wondering if I needed to do that. Okay, so now I've done that. Okay, great. So the personal story goes back to when I was 8 years old. I was at a summer camp about 100 miles north of Toronto, where I grew up. And on an evening there, I climbed into an aluminum rowboat with the elderly director of the summer camp, and he rowed us about a quarter mile out into the bay. And we spent the next 2 hours fishing. And I was quite successful at it. I caught 16 fish that day. Many of them were small and were released back into the water, but several of the larger ones were kept for breakfast the next morning. Mr. Nelson did all the dirty work. He baited the hooks with squirming earthworms. He pulled the hooks out of the fish's mouths, and he plunged his knife into the skulls of the keepers. I was a sensitive boy with a soft spot for animals, and a lot of what went on in that boat disturbed me, but this kindly man at the bow didn't seem to think there was anything wrong, so I rationalized, as we humans are so good at doing, I rationalized that everything was okay. I never took a shine to fishing. When it came time for me to bait my own hooks and remove them from fish's mouths, I soon lost whatever enthusiasm I had from that initial outing. I just couldn't help seeing it from their point of view. That was 50 years ago, and to this day, we have a very, our attitude to fishes hasn't changed much. We generally view them in one of two contexts, either as a source of food or a source of entertainment and recreation. So benign and beloved is the place of fishing in our culture that it's often gratuitously used as a symbol of all that's good about life, this being one example of that. Today, I want to invite you to a different view of these creatures. I've spent the last 4 years swimming with, writing about, and researching the lives of these animals, and culminating in this book, What a Fish Knows. And I've learned a great deal about these creatures. I'm a biologist and animal behaviorist, so I already knew a bit about them when I started researching, but I was aware that a lot of what science reveals about the lives of fishes doesn't percolate up to the public consciousness. So I wanted to make this information accessible to non-scientists and lay readers. So I want to start out with a little bit about the diversity of fishes. If this is a deep sea anglerfish, there's probably about 160 species, and you'll see two smaller, what look like kind of like appendages. They are both males hanging off the bottom of this fish, and they will have latched onto her at some point in their lives when they found her in the abyss, which is never gets any light because it's too deep for the sun to penetrate. And that may explain why they are opportunistic about catching hold of a female of the right species when they find her. And they literally become absorbed into her skin, and they share the same bloodstream, and they inseminate her intravenously. So it's loosely called sexual parasitism. I don't really like that word because it's as important for the female as for the male that the mating takes place. So it could be seen as parasitism in some sort of ways, but it's also beneficial to the female. So, but it's very bizarre, as I'm sure anyone will agree. Next slide. I want to talk a bit about fish perceptions now, how fishes sense their world. Fishes probably invented color vision. They probably invented all of the basic senses that we have that are familiar to us. They also have some sensory, next slide, they also have some sensory capacities that we don't, including this row of scales along the middle called the lateral line, which contains cells that are very sensitive to movements, and they can detect subtle pressure changes and current changes in the water, which is very useful, particularly at night when vision is not available to them. And the next slide is a fish that has no vision. This is a blind cavefish. They've evolved for a long period in dark habitats in caves, and so they don't need to waste energy on producing eyes. Curiously, if you raise them in the light, they will develop normal functional eyes. So they have all the genetics to do that. It's just not expressed in a dark environment. And yet they use their lateral lines, that row of darker pink purple scales along the side, they use their lateral lines to orient in the dark. Next slide shows a shark, which is a group of animals that have electroreception. I'm sure you can guess what that means. So they can perceive electrical signals, which is very useful for detecting, say, the heartbeat of a small, unfortunate creature trying to hide from them under the sand, and very useful for the shark to find and capture their prey, even though it may be out of view. The next slide shows two knife fishes named for their shape. They're South American, and they've taken electrical abilities to a new level. They communicate with it. They actually produce their own electrical signals deliberately. It's called an EOD, an electric organ discharge, and different individual fishes have their own unique electrical organ discharge, and they discharge at certain specific frequencies. And as this slide shows, if their frequencies are about the same, they can adjust them. They can make it less confusing, so they're not, their own sounds are not confused with another. The visual systems of fishes are very well developed. They have very good vision, most of them, the ones who live in lighted habitats, which is the great majority of them. These ambon damselfishes are an example, though, of a fish that has a special visual communication system that happens covertly. Next slide, and I think I may not have said next slide. You should have been looking at a slide of yellow fishes with a coral background. Do you see that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
The next slide actually shows a picture of the same ambon damselfish under normal visible light on the left and ultraviolet light on the right. These guys can see in ultraviolet light. Most fishes, including their predators, cannot. So it's a nice way that they're able to communicate and recognize each other with these fingerprint-like facial patterns in a way that doesn't compromise their camouflage to predators. Next slide shows just an illustration of a recent study done, I think in Germany, in which archerfish is the one on the far right in the tank looking up at the screen above with two faces, because these guys squirt water to catch insect prey, and I'll go into that shortly. They're very useful for studies in which you can get fishes to show a preference for one stimulus versus another. And using that approach, they showed that even with some cues missing, such as hair on the left and ears as well on the right, they can recognize different faces. So not only are fishes well known to recognize each other in studies as individuals, but they can also learn to recognize human faces. The next slide shows, just to illustrate one of a number of optical illusions that fishes fall for in the same way that we do. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion. Those two orange circles are the same size, but because of the arrangement of the blue-gray dots around each, the one on the right looks larger than the one on the left. And if you train fishes to select one of two dots that's larger than the other, and they get a food reward for doing that, and then you present them with this illusion, they will choose, in this case, the orange dot on the right. So they are, quote unquote, falling for the same optical illusion that we do. Similarly, for the Muller-Lyer illusion, in which the lower of the two horizontal lines is longer, looks longer, but in fact it's not longer. These red-tailed split fins, for instance, will choose the lower as the longer of two lines. And then this Canisa triangle, where there's actually no triangle in the figure at the left, but there's the appearance of a white triangle. Sharks, for instance, like this bamboo shark here, will indicate that they perceive a triangle. I think there's something poignant about the capacity to be fooled or tricked by an optical illusion, in terms of, it says that a fish can have beliefs. They can believe that there's something there when it actually isn't. And it says something about their perception of the world that mirrors our own. There's a lot more that could be said about that, and there's a lot more I say in the book, but let's move on to a little bit about fish cognition. And I keep forgetting, Lisa, because I'm in control of my slides, I keep forgetting to say next slide. So let's see if we're on the same slide. Are you on what a fish thinks?
Yes,
Or
I
maybe
am.
okay, so let's go to the next one after that. I will try to remember to say next slide. I'm just not used to having to do it. The next slide shows a large blue fish on the right with a clam in his mouth. It is a male, black-spotted tuskfish, and he's illustrating something that was once thought the sole province of humans, that is tool use. He has grabbed a clam. He has actually used water as a tool to uncover the clam by blowing water off the sand off the clam, I should say, picking the clam up, swimming to a very particular location where he will use some coral rocks as an anvil. And with a series of well-timed and coordinated head flicks and releases, he will break open this unfortunate mollusk to get at the contents inside to eat. You'll also see other fishes here who are watching. There's a lot of fishes are very alert to opportunities, and they're looking at what's going on around them, and they're probably hoping to get some of the tidbits that are cast off by this larger fish. But it's an example of tool use in a fish. Next slide shows back to the archer fishes we saw earlier with the face recognition study. They have this fascinating ability and this really great skill that they developed of squirting water at flying insects. And they use different techniques for hitting their targets depending on how far away it is. And they also have been shown to learn by observation. The two individuals on the left are younger and less experienced, and they can improve their accuracy and ability by simply watching others without having any first-fin experience of their own. And by doing that, they become more proficient. So it's an example of taking the perspective of another and learning from that. There's a lot more could be said about how they do that, but time doesn't allow that in this presentation. The next slide shows a chimpanzee at a computer screen performing something that is quite remarkable. That is a spatial memory that is far superior to the human spatial memory when numbers or probably any other kind of object are presented for a very brief period of time, and then they're removed. And you can watch YouTube videos of that, but we often don't think of fishes as having very good memories, spatial or otherwise. This next slide shows a fish that has a very good spatial memory. Because it's very useful for their survival. This is a frill-finned goby, about a 5-inch long fish of the Atlantic seaboard, and they live in the intertidal zone. The next slide shows a typical intertidal zone, and you can see a series of ponds. And at low tide, you'll see these guys in these ponds. But if a heron or an octopus or some other danger comes along, they are able to jump accurately the right direction and distance into neighboring tide pools. How do they do that? It was a question that scientists had pondered for a long time. A series of studies done finds that they jump accurately because they memorize the tide pools at high tide. So when the waves come in and then cover this area at high tide, these fishes swim over and in and out of this area, and they memorize the topography of these depressions in the rocks And then they can use that as a way to accurately jump from one tide pool to the next. And the next slide just shows a schematic illustration of how they would do that. And you can see, you can imagine why that's a very useful memory skill to have. It's called a mental map, but it requires a pretty impressive bit of cognition. Next slide. We'll go into what a fish feels now. I'm not even going to stay on this next slide, which is a quote from a textbook or a scholarly paper. It's one of the reasons I wrote What a Fish Knows, because the language that's used in science is not very accessible to non-humans. But essentially, it says that their makeup, how they're built, and how they function is comparable to how the mammals function. And of course, we are examples of mammals. The mammal on the left of the next slide is a researcher at Penn State University, a fish biologist named Victoria Braithwaite, and her 2010 book goes into the question of, do fish feel pain? It is a question mark, but really the question mark needn't be there. It's that fish do feel pain. It's quite clearly resolved by a number of studies, including her own and her colleagues' studies of trout. The next slide shows a picture of a trout in which they exposed, they anesthetized these animals, so they were not sensate to pain, fortunately, during the studies, and then they exposed different types of nerves to show that there are nociceptors on their faces that are sensitive to heat, to chemicals, and to physical injury, and they send signals to the brain. You might ask, is it necessary to do these studies? I'm not saying I necessarily support them by citing them. But unfortunately, there are skeptics who love to make careers out of questioning whether fishes even feel pain. There are still some who will make that claim. The next slide is a picture of another British researcher, Lynn Snedden, who did a study of zebrafishes showing that they will swim into an area of their complex tank that they would normally avoid because it's brightly lit and has nowhere to hide. Little fishes especially, do not like being in places like that. They feel vulnerable and scared. But if they were given a painful stimulus, in this case an injection of an acid, which probably has some lasting pain if they can feel pain, they would leave their preferred part of the tank and swim in the barren part of the tank. And they would only do that if painkiller was dissolved into the tank, into that particular part of the tank. So if there's lidocaine in the normally avoided part of the tank, they would swim there, which is quite compelling evidence of pain, not only pain, but the wherewithal to relieve pain when given the opportunity. The next slide, a couple of land snails. We can debate and scratch our heads about where to draw the line on sentience, the capacity to feel, such as pain and pleasure. And it's some question about whether snails can. I think we should give them the benefit of the doubt, but there's not really any reasonable doubt left about fishes. Another study that really reinforces this is a study of striated surgeonfishes, which you can see a couple of individuals here. When they were stressed, their cortisol levels go up in the blood. You can measure that, just as our cortisol levels go up in our bloodstreams as well. And then if you give them the opportunity to get a massage, to swim up to and be rubbed and stroked by a moving mechanical wand, they will do that, and their stress levels come down. If the wand is stationary, their stress levels do not change at all. So that's a quite good illustration of how fishes will take action to relieve stress, and that a massage is actually de-stressing for them. I'm going to get to cleaner plant stations in a little bit, and that's very relevant to this particular study, in which I'm happy to report these surgeonfishes were all returned to their natural homes in the Great Barrier Reef following the study. A recent study out of Norway, next slide, this should be a picture of two salmon here, one larger one and one smaller one on the bottom there. There's both the same age, but the ones at the bottom are stunted. They're examples of so-called dropout fish. They just simply fail to thrive in the stressful environments, crowded environments of aquaculture operations, and they float to the surface, they stop eating, and they die. And a recent study from Norway concluded that these animals, based on their behavior and their biochemistry, were severely depressed. They showed the hallmarks of severe negative affect or negative emotions, feeling very bad, and so bad that essentially, is it suicide? I haven't seen that suggested, but they certainly give up on trying to live. Next slide just shows a couple of drugs, which is a reminder to tell you that drugs such as Valium and antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs that are effective in humans also can have similar effects in fishes. Fish society, next slide, title slide, and then let's talk a little bit about the social aspects of fishes. This is Razor Boy, so named by Robert Wintner, aka Snorkel Bob, who took the photograph. He said this particular fish would be on this area of the reef when he went there. Fishes have their homes like we do. They swim in particular areas, and they're individuals. They're unique, and you can see some of them, as nicely illustrated by Razor Boy here, have independently swiveling eyes. They can look in different directions on either side of their head, kind of like chameleon lizards can do. And they have personalities. Razor Boy was shy at first towards Robert, but he got to know who Robert was, and he would approach him. And Robert said it became difficult to photograph him because he was always so close in my face that I had to shoo him away, so he was beyond my minimum focal field. So he had a very friendly character once he made friends with Robert. And fishes are known to make friends with trusted divers in areas that the divers return to. The next slide shows a cichlid, a blue and dark gray fish, pushing a semi-buoyant thermometer in a tank. This study was published. There were 3 cichlids, and the researchers studying them were not studying play in fishes, but they noticed what looked like play behavior. And indeed, this behavior was idiosyncratic to individuals. Each one expressed it differently. And the way they interacted with this semi-buoyant thermometer indicated that they were entertaining themselves. They were not, it fit a number of criteria for play that biologists have come up with. So we now have published evidence of play behavior in fishes. And you can watch YouTube videos of fishes who are being trained to push soccer balls and things like that. That may be debatable whether that's true play or more just sort of operant conditioning to perform tasks for food. But this was not about food in this case. It was true play behavior. Fishes learn to socialize with humans, especially if they're living alone in a tank all day long, such as this particular pufferfish, that's the one on the left, and they don't get to see their human for 8 or 9 hours. Then the human comes home, and in this case, Mango, this is the name of this 9-year-old pufferfish on the left, would seem to be very happy to see Talia come home, and they would have these long staring contests, she called them, and he would usually win. This next slide illustrates a bunch of herrings which have been found to have an unusual type of communication. In live audiences, I asked for a show of hands if anyone has heard of flatulent communication, and usually I don't see any hands go up unless anyone's had the misfortune of sitting through my lecture before. And but in fact, herrings do actually release bubbles from their rear ends as a way of communicating information about when to move to another part of the water column. Say it's nighttime and they want to be in a safe place for the night. And there are scientists who studied this, call the sounds that these bubbles make frequent repetitive ticks. I'll let you form the acronym from that, which was a deliberate device by the scientists to be cutesy. And I'm trying to be cutesy here with the next slide, which is a little cartoon I did to illustrate. The next slide shows what you might call virtue in fishes. These are rabbit fishes of 4 different species, and there's 4 pairs in each quadrant. And in each case, you have one fish foraging with the head buried in the coral, which is a very vulnerable position to be in, because predators could come and approach you and you wouldn't see them coming. And the other fish is head up, playing a lookout. And this is a vigilant behavior. So they work as pairs, they feed as pairs, and they switch out. After every couple of minutes, the other one comes up and the one who's been playing lookout gets to feed for a while. So it's a way that they both get fed, but they're both safer in doing so. It's a nice example of social virtue in a non-human or non-mammal, in a fish in this case. Next slide is still from a video that you can watch on YouTube of a really remarkable interaction between 2 different species in which the grouper, the large fish in the background, and a moray eel you might see in the right middle ground, who they cooperate. And the grouper will signal using a head shake to invite the moray to go hunting, to go foraging with the grouper. If the moray eel is in the mood, they swim off together over the reef and they have a higher success rate per capita if they work together, because the moray can go ferret-like into the nooks and crannies, and if the fish escapes the moray, the grouper is waiting on the outside to catch the prey. So they both do better by cooperating. The next slide is a courtship illustration between two hamlet fishes, and courtship can be quite complex in fishes, and it often involves touch as well. There's also an interesting twist that fishes have the capacity to change sex, or a lot of species do. About 1 in 4 species on the reef can change sex from one day to the next. Sometimes they can just change in one direction. Sometimes they can change to male and female again, all without expensive surgery, I might add. And it's a very useful way to optimize reproduction for them. The next slide shows a structure that was mysterious when it was discovered off the south coast of Japan just a few years ago by an underwater photographer. About 6 feet wide, quite beautiful, rather like a crop circle. So the photographer set up a camera, an underwater camera, and discovered that the next slide shows a little 4-inch long pufferfish, which was previously unknown to science. The male spends several days, next slide, swimming back and forth in the sand, moving his fins in such a way as to create this, next slide, beautiful mandala-like structure, which is an attraction for females. And if the female is so dutifully impressed that they will mate, and they will leave the eggs in the middle, cover them with bits of shell and whatnot. I don't quite know why that works. You would think this is a big badge saying, here are the eggs, come and get them. But obviously it evolved, so it must work. And I consider it as really art by fishes, so an example of aesthetic beauty. Next slide just illustrates the widespread parenting that goes on in fishes. We often think of fishes as egg layers. They just drop their egg and spawn, and that's it. A lot of fishes do that, which is nothing to be scoffed at. It's just a different strategy. But a lot of fishes, like these so-called mouth-brooding cichlids, of which there are hundreds of species, they are named for their habit of protecting their babies in their mouths if there's danger nearby. The male literally inhales them and holds them in there for a little bit. They know the drill. And then when the coast is clear, he lets them out. And parenting is known in about 1/4 of all fish species. Next slide, fish pleasure. I want to talk a little bit about that. And the next slide shows 2 little fishes swimming against the side of a larger, I think it's a 5-banded angelfish. Those 2 fishes are a team of cleaner fishes. They're blue-striped cleaner wrasses, and cleaner wrasses are quite famous for being part of perhaps one of the most well-studied and complex social systems and mutualisms that is a benefit between both species in nature. The way it works, next slide illustrates it nicely too. Client fishes, in this case a puffer, they swim up to the cleaning station where these cleaner fishes ply their trade, and then they open their mouths and let the cleaners swim in. They never eat them. It's not a good idea to eat your business partner. And the cleaner fishes swim in and out of the gills, and they pluck parasites and remove algae and other undesirables off the surface of these client fishes, of which there are more than 100 different species. So it's a classic mutualism where both parties benefit. The cleaner fishes get food, and the client fishes get a spa treatment and a parasite removal service. It's more complicated than that. It can get Machiavellian. Cleaners tend to do a better job if there are more clients in the queue than if there are just a few, because they don't have as many. They have more potential customers to impress. So clients, for their part, do what's called image scoring. They keep accounts of cleaner quality service, and if the cleaners are not doing such a good job, if they're not removing many parasites, or heaven forbid they're mucus nipping, which is when they take a little bit of that slimy layer off the outer side of the client, that makes the client jolt, and that probably sends a signal to other clients in the queue that maybe these guys aren't the best ones to pair up with that day. So it's really truly a complex social system that has many more nuances than what I've described here, but time doesn't permit more. But it's really quite remarkable. And it may also explain why fishes such as this Nassau grouper will swim up to trusted divers to get stroked. This harks back to the earlier study of surgeon fishes I mentioned. Apparently feels very nice. It's a de-stressing thing for them, just as a massage is for us. There's no parasite removal going on here, and yet the fishes do it. So in my conclusion is pleasure is what motivates the behavior. I spoke at a vet school in Kansas last year, and a student came up to me afterwards and said she and her father do this as well. They stroke a Nassau grouper in another part that she described, another area in the Caribbean. And so she said, I'll send you some pictures, and these next 3 photographs are some mugshots with this fish. So, Lisa, there should be 3 slides in a row, the last one of which is a man holding his regulator with the air bubbles going under the gills of this fish. Apparently, it feels very nice. The next slide should be a picture of a shark with a diver, and the shark is resting on the diver's lap. And that shark has been lulled into a state of supreme relaxation by being stroked and petted. There are scads of YouTube videos now of tiger sharks having their faces rubbed, and other sharks. Sharks have been completely mismeasured by us. They're not savages who try to eat humans. In fact, it appears quite obviously that humans taste like Brussels sprouts to sharks. They just don't like the taste of us, unfortunately, because their teeth are sharp and our skin is soft. One mistaken taste can be deadly, but it's almost always, if not always, mistaken identity. Sometimes it's aggression. People don't heed sharks, and they don't do the right thing and give them their space. But most interactions with sharks and humans, from the shark's perspective, like this, are friendly and good. Of course, we are killing up to 100 million a year. I will touch on that briefly towards the end. I'm getting towards that part of the talk. The next slide just shows another picture of this, particularly this gray reef shark, Caribbean reef shark, I think, who's very relaxed. And the diver on the left is one of many who removes fish hooks from these sharks when they're in this relaxed state. This blue shark in the next slide, you can see a very large fishing hook buried in his mouth. And a few minutes after this photo was taken, bolt cutters were used to remove that hook, and this blue shark hung around for quite a while afterwards. One can speculate what the shark was feeling, but the divers wondered if perhaps he or she was feeling gratitude towards the divers. That's known from whales. We shouldn't sell sharks short with their large brains, that they cannot also have similar feelings of gratitude. One more slide of sharks. A shark being kissed. It feels good to us to help them as well. And that's part of the theme of this seminar series. You know, we can be hopeful that we can change our relationship with these animals and have better relationships in the future than the rapacious killing one that we've had in the past. That is us killing them, not them killing us. Next slide, sentience, the bedrock of ethics. Sentience is the capacity to feel. I'll take a moment to promote a new journal. It's an online open access journal called Animal Sentience that I'm one of the founding editors of, and it's the first journal ever to focus on animal feeling. And I think it's a sign of the times that we are now taking a scientific and societal interest in animals' capacity to feel, which is fundamental, I think, to ethical changes in how we think of and treat our fellow creatures on this planet. The next slide is a sad illustration of how we're not treating them well. We kill anywhere from hundreds of billions to perhaps over 2 trillion a year. It's so easy to forget that each one is a unique individual who has or had a life with not just a biology, but a biography. The next slide is a close-up of a shrimping net from Mozambique, and you will look hard to find any shrimp in there. There are a few, but it illustrates the terrible waste of fishing. Not only are the methods of dying pretty horrible, crushing, decompression, exsanguination, suffocation, but also very wasteful industry where the nets are not very choosy about what they catch. And the next slide just shows an example of a pile of bycatch, which is a term for unwanted and discarded marine life that is either dead or dying. It's estimated we produce 200 million pounds of bycatch every day worldwide. There are ancillary problems to commercial fishing, including slavery, where young and other underprivileged people end up on these boats. They're being paid almost nothing. In fact, they may be paid nothing, and they're stuck out at sea, and essentially they're living the lives of slaves, and that has been well documented. You may have heard of aquaculture. It's essentially factory farming of fishes, and a lot of it happens in fish open water habitats that are these pens here. that the next slide shows, where the fishes are contained in each of these pens. It's crowded, parasite loads are very high, pesticides are high, waste is high, and it all leaches out into the surrounding habitat, as do the fishes, many of which have been genetically modified. So you have contamination at that level as well. There's just a lot of serious problems with fish aquaculture, and people need to be aware, consumers need to be aware that these fishes are leading miserable lives. Methods of killing them are typically not um, under humane regulation, and they're not really much better than what happens in wild fishes in most cases. This next slide shows some shark fins, of which this is a very serious problem that most listeners have probably heard about. And there are a great deal of efforts, including the Humane Society of the U.S., but other organizations are working very hard to stop this with some campaigns in China, where it's most rampant. And it's been quite effective. The fins are used in soup, and the soup doesn't even need the fins to have the quality that it can have. You can easily do that with plant-based materials. So it's just something that's it's a inertia that needs to be stopped. The next slide, just a sobering statistic. An estimate of half the marine life has been lost in the oceans since 1970. And I can tell you that we'd already taken a lot before 1970. If you look through the annals of history, there were commercial extinctions of fishes back in the 19th century, never mind 1970. Next slide, just a quick list of some of the problems currently facing fishes in their habitats. So you've probably heard of ocean warming relating to climate change, of course, and ocean acidification. Just keep clicking, Lisa, and it'll show these terms will come up on the screen. Ocean acidification is one of the things that's also happening because of our activities. Coral bleaching is a result of these problems. Microplastics, tiny little beads of plastic produced in plastic manufacturing that are infiltrating the oceans in the numbers of quintillions in some waterways in the world. And then lastly, at the bottom, discarded fishing gear. An estimated 680,000 tons of fishing gear is left in the oceans every year, discarded, thrown away, cut loose. Unfortunately, that fishing gear still wreaks havoc long after humans have found it useful. Next slide, just click it twice and the word oxygen comes up. I just use that to remind people that the oceans are the primary producer of oxygen. More than half of all the world's oxygen supply comes from blue-green algae in the oceans. As go the oceans and water habitats, so go land-dwelling creatures who depend on a good ecosystem. So this talk isn't just about being kind to fish, it's being good to their habitats as well. The next slide is a brilliant graphic from NASA, which illustrates beautifully how precious water is, and that even though 3/4 of the surface of the Earth is covered by water, the actual total amount of water on this otherwise solid planet is quite small, and it's only 1% of that little bead of water that is as fresh and usable, quote unquote, usable for us. I mean, that's a very anthropocentric view. I think part of the problem with our relationship with nature is that we tend to put it all in the context of our own needs instead of thinking about sharing it with the other creatures who need it as well. And then the next slide, just to illustrate the fickle nature of our relationship with animals. There's no fish here, but these two creatures are so differently treated depending on where you are in the world. The one on the left is a source of food in our culture. The one on the right is a beloved pet. The one on the left in some parts of the world is revered as a sacred creature, and the one on the right is food. So we are very fickle, and I love what George Bernard Shaw said quite poignantly, something to the effect of, custom will reconcile us to any atrocity. Custom is what's at work here, not really logic. The next slide is a close-up of a beautiful speckled trout. And he just reminds me, or she reminds me of just reminding people that fishes have had the disadvantage of evolving literally out of view for us. It's only in the last century that we've had the technology with scuba and underwater filming equipment to really look at their lives as they live them. And those staring eyes don't indicate an unfeeling creature. I mean, their eyes are bathed in water throughout their lives. They don't need to blink. And if they blinked, that might trigger some sympathy from us. Similarly, the voice, they make lots of sounds, including sounds indicating pain and suffering. But just as we're not very effective if we stick our heads under the water and shout and scream, their sounds are not heard to us above the water. So they've had some disadvantages. But if we look carefully into their lives and we observe them and see the complexity of what they do, well, I, for one, have become convinced after 4 years of delving into their lives that fishes are equally deserving of our moral consideration and our respect as all other vertebrates are. The next slide is a close-up of a discus fish who I will name Jasper. He isn't actually Jasper, but Jasper was a discus fish who was kept by a woman in Florida. And they formed a friendship, just as Mango, that little puffer you saw earlier, formed friendship. And this is something that we can take heart from. These animals can connect with us. They have biographies, not just biologies, as I said earlier. And Jasper would be very happy whenever Karen got home from work, and they would play a game of chasing each other back and forth in the tank. And then after that, she would cup her hands and lower them into the water. And she would hold her hands in that cup shape. And when Jasper saw the hands, he would swim onto his side, swim into her hands, and just nestle there in her hands, cradled in her hands, and she would gently stroke him with her thumbs. And this was something they would do pretty much every day she came from work, and it was a bonding for them. And it just says how much is going on inside a fish, that a fish can relate and connect with a human like that. And so it's my hope that we will relate to and connect with them in a way that we haven't been doing. And that's the hope that I have, and it's a hope that's shared by the Jane Goodall of Oceans and Fishes, Sylvia Earle. And you can all read, I'll let you read this last slide, or penultimate slide. And the take-home message here is that we can all help fishes immediately by deciding what we buy at the supermarket and what we put on our plate. And the very last slide is just a picture of a gorgeous fish, like so many, an individual. And it just my take-home message of this is that we can all do better by fishes and their lives. And I hope that you'll join me in respecting them and giving them a better world to live in than we have been doing. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this presentation. Now we're reorienting a little bit. We've got you on the webcam, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Sally if there are any questions in the chat box.
Okay. Nothing's coming through yet, but I think people are probably typing, so it takes a moment for them to get their messages in. But that was fantastic, Jonathan. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I loved it.
I have a comment from Melissa who says that was beautiful. Thank you for speaking up for the fishes.
You're welcome, Melissa. Thank you for listening.
Mm.
Would it be okay if I speak a question or a comment, or do you just want them in the chat box?
It's fine with me. I can hear you.
Yep.
Well, first off, I wanted to thank you so much, Jonathan. I know a lot about mammals, and I've respected fishes, and because they're sentient beings, but I didn't know how amazing they were. You've really helped me to really understand that. And looking at things like the face recognition, I mean, I couldn't even pick those faces out. That was really remarkable.
Me neither.
So, I'm really blown away by all this information, and can only imagine your amazing pain at seeing what's being done in the oceans every single day. So I was wondering, since the talk had to go so quickly because of the tech problems at the beginning, do you have any lectures online that maybe are a bit fuller and aren't quite so rushed that maybe I could listen to or watch?
Yeah, thanks for the feedback. Something I'm working on is pacing, and I do tend to go a little fast, and the technical difficulties made me feel a little bit more pressed than usual, although I did skip some slides. Yes, the answer to your question is yes. In fact, I'm just trying to pull up the YouTube video that was filmed in Toronto last year, me giving a very similar lecture. The talk evolves, so there's some different slides and such, and there's some elements that I may have glossed over here. Let me just see if I can just find it briefly, and I'd be happy to take another question in the meantime.
Great.
I don't know if there's a place where I can
question.
cut. Sorry to interrupt. I don't know if there's a place I can cut and paste the URL, but
Yes, there is a chat box.
In the chat box.
It's on the side panel where there's several icons there, and one of them is chat, and you
okay.
can open it up. And if you do that, when you click on there, you can just copy and paste it directly into the chat box there.
Okay, I'll do that right now because I just found the link. It was organized by ZooCheck, so that's another search that people can give. But I will put the URL right now, and that's just sent. Okay.
Wonderful.
Right.
Thank
Was there
you.
another question?
I have a comment from Suzanne. She said that was such an interesting presentation. It's not a question, but a comment. I was happy to suggest your book to my niece for Christmas gift for her husband, whose hobby is fishing. It's his favorite thing to do. I hadn't read your book, but I know enough to know that you would be advocating for fish. I haven't had a chance to find out what impact the book had on him. My surreptitious hope is for him to give up fishing and start preaching that to his fisher buddies.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's the highest compliment.
Yeah, and personally for me, I have a friend who likes to fish, which I completely disagree with, but I'm thinking of sending him your recording at the end of once we get the replay link.
By all means, do.
Yeah,
There's a lot of people who fish, including my dear brother, who I love as a brother. And he's read my book, and he's conflicted. But that's partly why I wrote the book, because I hope that a lot of fishermen will read it and take some information from it, and maybe reflect on their future relationship with these creatures.
Yeah, great. I have a few questions coming in now, so I think we've got 3 lined up. So Marco is asking, he said, "Hi, Jonathan, thank you so much. That was wonderful and very useful. How come you mentioned about antidepressants and other drugs related to fishes? You were maybe referring to pharmaceutical researchers using fishes, or maybe something else?"
Yeah, really my goal, and I didn't make that very clear, was to just try to reinforce the point that that's why I call them cousins. It's a provocative term in the subtitle of the book, our underwater cousins, but they're vertebrates. They're full members of the vertebrate group, and the fact that they respond comparably to pharmaceuticals is another way of illustrating that. So that was my primary reason for using that example.
Great, thank you. And then Elizabeth has a question, and she says, "It's heartening to see work done on recognizing the sentience of fish. I know this is out of your sphere of expertise, but I'm deeply concerned about the fact that there seems to be no effort on the part of world leaders to address population growth. Do you have any thoughts on why this is so?"
I'm assuming Elizabeth's referring to human population growth. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for raising that issue. I try to bring that issue up. In fact, I probably should work it into this talk, because it's a true elephant in the room that's just so important. So many of the world's problems stem from too many humans. It's not an anti-human position to say that we need to stem our own population growth. I would argue it's a pro-human position, because as we become more abundant, global conflicts, struggles, lack of resources for people become more prominent, climate change, huge mass migrations that will result from that. So it's a pro-human position to say that we need to stem our growth. Thank you for mentioning that issue. I actually mentioned it in a question to Jane Goodall at a conference last year in Brussels, Belgium, and she thanked me for broaching that issue, and she agrees it's a very, very important issue that must get on the political agenda, and it isn't right now.
Thank you. And Alex is asking, he said, or she said, "Is there a plant-based shark fin product being marketed to high-end restaurants in Asia?"
Nice question. I wish I had a concrete answer to that. I'd like to find out myself. If you find out, send me an email, please. But I'm not aware of that specifically. However, we totally have the technology to do it. The whole plant-based meats and so-called, faux meats and faux cheeses, for that matter, are advancing very rapidly now. Now that humans are putting their minds to it, including the in vitro meats, where the cell tissue cultures is maybe not something that many vegans or vegetarians are that interested in having or trying. But for people who still eat animals, to know that it's animal tissue, but it was grown in a clean lab, is another option that's being developed. So I don't know if anything specifically is being done in terms of faux shark fin. I would hope so. I actually just have a slab of plant-based fish in my freezer. I bought it last week in St. Petersburg, and I'm curious to see what it's like. I feel like it's an academic relevance to me and my expertise, and it's not real fish, but we can get great tasting stuff. So it can be done. I hope it is being done, because there's certainly a need.
Thank you. And I think, Joan, did you have a question? You mentioned.
I do. I have a few questions. Well, I just
Okay.
a few comments. First of all, thank you so much. I love this topic, and it's funny because my mother's cousin's husband was the head of fisheries at the University of Washington. So as a little child, I used to go out and out on big barges and watch, I didn't know what I was little, but I was looking at, fish and tide pools. We had really wonderful experiences with tide pools. And so it's always been a fascination of mine. And had a very similar experience with fishing with that same set of cousins, where I was just overwhelmed just with one fish and haven't been able to do it. So anyway, but since then I've been taking people on dolphin trips and a lot of wildlife trips, and I've become fascinated with sharks, and I wondered, what do you think of families of sharks? Do you think that they stay together? Because I noticed you had a lot about your sharks, so I thought I'm going to ask, do you find that do babies recognize their mothers later on? I mean, how does that work? Because I know they stay together for a while and then they go off on their own.
Yeah, I can't claim to be an expert in that. As you probably know, many sharks bear quote-unquote live young. Some of them have these pouches where the young is left, so there's no parental care in that case. But in the parental care species, or the live young species, to the degree that there's parental care, there's probably going to be recognition. They'll know who's who. And also in assemblages of sharks where they all gather together, I would be surprised if there's not individuals who, they may not call each other Joe and Sharon, but they probably know each other as individuals.
Yeah, I always wondered about that. And then also, just to your point about the stroking of the fish, there's a place out in the Bahamas where people go and stroke the stingrays, and it's really, so they just come up and get stroked. So I've got many pictures of that.
Yeah, there's some notable anecdotes about mantas and some other rays being stroked by humans and appearing to really like that. I quote one person in my book, and also you may have heard of the mantas who've had seem to be soliciting, as dolphins do, soliciting help from divers to remove fishing gear and fishing line from their bodies. That indicates a level of awareness that is far beyond what we've generally attributed to fishes. I co-authored a comment in a journal last year on the heels of a paper suggesting it was a small sample of just two individuals, but two manta rays in a captive setting with a large mirror appeared to be behaving in front of the mirror in a way that suggests self-recognition, which is another sort of hallmark of high levels of intelligence and awareness. So we've just sold these animals short. The more we look, the more we find that they're doing things and experiencing things far beyond what we thought they could do.
Well, if you need any pictures of stingrays being stroked, I've got a billion years worth.
Please do. A couple of things there. I have a Facebook page called What a Fish Knows. If you send me some pictures, I'll be happy to post them on that Facebook page. I also produce a monthly newsletter called All Things Fish. If you go to my website, jonathanbalcombe.com, you can see the subscription there. You can subscribe from there if you want to get that. And I could include one of those pictures in that newsletter as well. I would love to do that. So please do send.
Yeah, I shall. I've got video too.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. I have one thing to share as well, which is My dad was often fishing when I was a child, and he told me that the fish couldn't feel anything. And actually, it was well into my adult years I just had this epiphany that he had lied to me after all those years. I don't think he did it to hurt me, but I think he had his own agenda there. And your book is profound. I mean, it unequivocally explains in detail that fish feel and they're sentient beings. I am so excited for your upcoming project about sentient beings, and
Yeah.
really look forward to following up and keeping tabs on you and what you're doing. This is so exciting. It's profound for the animal rights movement. I'm just so grateful to you and all you do for the animals.
Oh, thank you. Happy to do it. I feel privileged to
And
be in a situation where I can do this stuff.
I have that
don't
book
forget
too.
how profound this book is.
Yes, I've got that one.
Yeah. So, unless we have any other questions, I think we'll wrap up our webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I know that everyone has busy lives, and we're so grateful to you for tuning into this, and to Jonathan for his for being such a good sport with regards to the technical issues. And we're very grateful to have you here and to share your knowledge with us. And for those who want a little bit more, we do have an advocacy kit from Jonathan that's posted on the web page for this event, which is idausa.org/Hope Summit. And when you go there, you'll see it's already uploaded onto the page. You can download the information from Jonathan about how to get more involved, where to learn more, and to stay tuned on what he's doing. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and to Jonathan. And we hope that you'll stay tuned. Our next presentation on Thursday will be with Mark Ching and Kiana Kang. They will be discussing the dog meat industry in Southeast Asia. So stay tuned for more, and we're so happy to have this opportunity to be able to provide hope for the animals in this time. So thanks to my co-host Joan Ranquet, and again Jonathan and Sally, and we look forward to having everyone join us again on Thursday.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone.
Very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.